Hello everyone, welcome to the Jane Addams Branch webinar on women in media and film. It's great to have you. Unfortunately, we do have a little bad news. Dr. Sabrina Cornish, the Assistant Professor of Communication and Media Studies, is not available to give her presentation this evening, but Elaine Fisher of the Jane Addams Branch is standing in and will make her presentation on her behalf, followed by Dr. Chelsea Crawford. They're both professors from the North Central College. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsor, AAUW Illinois, for the Leg Up grant. This is a local engagement grant to enable us to purchase the GoToMeeting platform to hold the webinar. I'm going to pass over now to Elaine Fisher, who is going to make the initial presentation. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to write them into the chat box and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Elaine.
Alrighty, thanks, Kate. I'm filling in for Sabrina Cornish, and she gets all the credit for the development of this program. And I was able to view her presentation in person at our Naperville branch meeting. So hopefully I can do justice to her information. So as at the beginning, we need to think about sort of one of the key theories of communication, the framing theory. And this states that media not only focuses our attention on a particular topic or event, and then they place them within a field of meaning. So they have control of the primary agenda that we focus on and maybe the secondary as to how we view what they're presenting. And this suggests that the way things are presented influence the choice people make about how they process the information. So if they might devalue the presenter, they might devalue the information, depending on how it's presented, and the presenter affects how the viewer categorizes that information. So it's very important that we examine how the media packages information that they present to us, the public, kind of keeping a critical eye on the things we receive and how they're presented to us. And we're going to look at two people who served in the same role, one male, one female, as White House press secretary. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, of course, the current press secretary, and Sean Spicer, the former White House press secretary. And here you have a couple more images of the two of them in responding and calling on reporters. You can see their different expressions and their manner. And here's another set of images where you can see Sarah perhaps is touching her hair. That's kind of a habitual thing. And Sean seems to be in charge and has his hands at his side. So you have kind of a contrast there. And here's yet another one where they are listening or replying to a reporter, and it shows some of their gestures or facial expressions. Now, when you do a search of the New York Times articles and look at the images, they're categorized by topic. And if you glance over the Sarah Huckabee Sanders list, you see the sort of the sixth, right in the middle, you have the topic of makeup. The rest of the topics are related to trends, sources, hits, details. Over to the right, the White House or briefing. Whereas if you look at Sean Spicer down below, you have the briefing, the evening briefing, press, Melissa McCarthy's impersonation, the House, and bathrobe might seem to be personal, but that's about President Trump's bathrobe. It was a BBC story that got some conversation going. So you don't see anything about Sean Spicer's suits or ties or makeup or anything personal. It's all about the news and the briefings, the president, etc. So you can see right there, there's a difference in the way the two were treated in the articles. And here's again a sample of the images when you click on one of those, the various images of Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Some more positive, others negative. And these are related to the stories that were reported in the New York Times. And some of them you can see she's sort of up at the upper left, the quizzical look, whereas others she's smiling in the lower row. In the middle, she might be frowning at something. And some she's wearing more makeup and some less makeup, since that seems to be a topic that they're talking about her regarding makeup. Not fair, but they are definitely talking about her appearance. So here's a sample of one of the articles about Spicer, and this was a New York Times interviewer talking about him putting on makeup because he was going to do a television story. And he wants to make sure that if makeup is mentioned, it's in context, and it's because he's going on TV. He makes the comment that too many reporters are looking for a snarky angle. But in this report, there's no put down of Spicer because he's using makeup. It's presented as a realistic expectation for someone going on TV. However, now we have the contrast. The LA Times columnist David Horsey published a commentary about Huckabee Sanders that concentrated more on her gender and appearance than the actual job she's doing as press secretary. And if you look at this cartoon image, it certainly is not complimentary. It's probably showing her militaristic kind of approach to managing reporters. She's the Trump sergeant at arms here, and not a good facial expression. So let's look at what he actually wrote. It gets even worse. He says she does not look like the kind of woman Donald Trump would have chosen because she's not blonde, sleek, a beauty like Ivanka or Melania. And in the second paragraph, he says she's more like a slightly chunky soccer mom who would be more comfortable in sweats and running shoes. And he comments on fake eyelashes and formal dress she puts on for the news briefings, like that is something fake, whereas there's no commentary about Sean Spicer dressing up with a suit and a tie for press briefings. So it's unequal treatment. As you see in the comment below, Steve Riley says, find me anything written about Sean Spicer, Josh Ernest, or Jay Carney that begins with 2 paragraphs about his appearance and body shape. David does have one slightly positive backhanded compliment at the end of those 2 paragraphs, that Trump is lucky to have Sanders. So he must be going on to say something positive. But the first 2 paragraphs are key, where he's attacking her based on her appearance. And here's another comment on Sarah, comparing Spicer with Sarah. Spicer never seemed entirely at home in his domicile of deception, but Sarah dwells without evident compunction in a gaudier fairyland of grander fictions. No panic, no squeak, just a repulsed expression. So again, she's doing her job, but she's being attacked for being comfortable with it. On the other side, we have Sean Spicer. They're sort of saying he would occasionally flirt with being a sympathetic figure, and people might feel sorry for the guy. But then they go on to talk about Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And they say, Sarah has all the sparkle and charm of an airline call center employee who tells you there's no way you can get on a flight to Chicago until next Wednesday. So again, sympathetic treatment for Sean Spicer and attacking Sarah for lacking sparkle and charm, and the fact that she delivers the facts and the president's message with no bones about it. She's doing her job. So I hope you were able to look at the Saturday Night Live satires of both of these individuals in their press secretary roles. Melissa McCarthy plays Sean Spicer, and they really pick on his anger and hand motions related to his annoyance with certain reporters, and they show him with using excessive gum chewing as kind of a way of coping with some of this, as well as using symbols and objects to simplify what he's trying to say for some of the reporters. But you see throughout the whole thing, he is still dressed in a suit and tie, and he looks professional, even though he's kind of over the top with uncontrollable anger. However, on the other hand, Sarah Huckabee Sanders initially is dressed in a nice dress with pearls, but then you see on the right, she morphs into this kind of sexy outfit with the low-cut dress and the flouncy sleeves. And then you have something that looks like an evangelist revival meeting. And then she goes on to some sort of a sexual innuendo section. And then she is attacking the New York Times in some sort of a biker or Avenger looking outfit. So you see the difference in the way she was treated in the satire compared to the way sort of the hands-off way that Sean Spicer was portrayed. This is much more extreme and non-professional, using and emphasizing her sex and totally disrespecting Sarah, kind of in every way possible. But I hope you enjoyed both of those, and if you haven't had a chance to look at them, be sure you do. Other comments on the two of them, David DeCoste is talking about he can't watch the press conference anymore, and he's implying that she's confused and maybe she doesn't understand what she's saying, or it's sad that she allowed herself to be used in a dishonest way. Well, that's his opinion, but he's attacking her integrity, and she basically is doing what she's expected to do in her job. And Patrick, he's talking that basically attacking her integrity. Facts don't matter, truth doesn't matter. She may actually believe this nonsense that she's spewing. She's the poster child for Trump's base. And then the closing remark, a pathetic figure. I wonder if she ever learned how to use reason and reflection. So it's really a personal attack on her for doing her job. And again, these are Twitter comments, and they're really kind of over the top. You can see how outrageous they are. And here's a few more Twitter comments about the two press secretaries. This one says, Sanders looks like she's having an emotional breakdown. At least Spicer made it look like fun. And John Cole is picking up on the previous article, slightly chunky soccer mom, but goes one step further and says she's a fat cow put there just so we would stop laughing at Spicer. So these are totally unfair kind of comments targeting a woman in a powerful role as press secretary. So wrapping it up, you can see that gender absolutely matters in every facet of society. And women in high-profile jobs like this are often judged on their appearance first, and then how they actually do the job. And women and men are still not treated equally despite doing the same job. There is a huge schism in politics between men and women and the words and images used to describe them. Women who exude traditional male characteristics are often criticized for not being soft enough or sympathetic or pleasant. You can see that in the comments that Sarah got. And men in politics are judged for their actions, whereas women are judged first on their appearance, and then maybe they would get a comment on how they're doing their job. You remember the final comment of David Horsey, Trump is lucky to have her. If you made it through the 2 paragraphs where he was negative about everything about her appearance. So as Kate said, we would like you to enter your questions in the chat box or comments, examples that you've heard of that are similar to this example. There are many examples, I'm sure. And we will get to the questions and comments at the end. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Chelsea Crawford to talk about women in film. Oops.
Okay, I think my screen is being shared now, if I'm correct. First, I want to thank Kate and Elaine for inviting me, and Kate for being incredibly supportive as I try to work through my first webinar. So hopefully all goes well. So this is part of a broader interest that I have in representation of all sorts of types of people who are sort of non-normative, that is, persons of color, gender concerns, representations of sexual identity and sexualities, for instance. So this is part of a broader series of questions that I'm sort of asking. And when I initially was thinking about this presentation, I remember recalling an episode of The Office, which is ironically entitled, or perhaps not ironically, Women's Appreciation. And just to give you some sort of context for the episode before we watch a brief clip from it, the episode, Michael here, who you should see on your screen right now, is the boss of this small office, and he is considering breaking up with his girlfriend, who is also his boss. And he can't decide whether or not to do it, and he ends up spending an entire day with the women who work in his office place, and takes them to, of all places that he thinks that they would absolutely love to go, he takes them to the mall, and sort of rewards them for their advice by letting them shop at Victoria's Secret on his dime. So this is his sort of reflection at the end of the episode about what he took away from spending an entire day with these women he normally works with. So there should be captions below your screen so we can sort of capture the dialogue here. So, of course, Steve Carell's little joke there at the end that women are all of these sort of stereotypes, flighty, emotional, irrational, and that's what he took away from spending time with them. And in fact, the sort of roles that he assigns to the various workers in his office are, of course, the sort of ditzy woman, the cold, heartless woman, the woman who apparently is nothing more than materialism because he would wish for her a television. She also is the sort of larger of the women, I think pointing again to some of these questions of body type or non-ideal body type. And then the sort of weakling. So these are the women. These are the roles that they play, or how he sees their personalities sort of being summed up, and how he could wish certain things for them that would cure their various problems, which are, of course, incredibly stereotypical. A sort of famous test that gets applied to film and television quite frequently when we're talking about gendered representation is called the Bechdel test. This actually initially came out of a graphic novel, out of a comic book, out of two characters discussing women's roles, stereotypes, and characters. And for a film or television show, usually we talk about it with respect to film in particular, to pass the Bechdel test, it has to pass all three of these, or we can speak of it as passing just one, two, or all three of these criteria. The first is that it has to have two female characters. There's a little bit of a discrepancy between some folks about whether those characters, in order to be considered characters, have to have names, or if they can merely be girl at party number one. For my purposes, I feel that it's more useful to think of a character as someone having an actual name. First and last would be ideal. So at least 2 female characters is the first level. The second is that those 2 characters or 2+ characters have to speak to each other at some point in time in the course of the film. And the last, and perhaps the trickiest of the 3, is that they must speak to one another about something other than men. So to pass the Bechdel test completely, you only need 2 named female characters who at some point in time in an 1.5 to 2.5 hour long movie have a conversation about any other subject on the planet than men. I found this video. I haven't given you audio here, so I'm just going to let it run. But this is from a website called Feminist Frequency, and it's just going to give you a series of films that do not pass the Bechdel test. So you can see them running in the upper left-hand corner here. And of course, the sort of joke here is that our presenter gets so sort of bored by the ongoing number of film titles that do not pass the Bechdel test that she wanders away and gets a snack while waiting for this entire series to run. This is a chart that I generated according to the data on BechdelTest.com, which is an open source website where users can enter a film title and whether or not it passes the Bechdel test. So as you can see here, almost 7,500 films, and this was as of about 3 weeks ago when I generated this particular graph. So about 7,500 films that are included in this database on BechdelTest.com. And this largest piece of the pie is actually films that completely pass the Bechdel test. That is all 3 of those criteria. 2 female characters who are named, who speak to one another at some point in the course of the film about any other subject than the men in their lives. So it's about 57% of films. So on the one hand, I suppose that seems like a high number, but on the other hand, that leaves more than 40% that do not pass all 3 of those sort of simple criteria. In fact, this next largest piece is the one that passes only one of the characteristics of the Bechdel test, and that is that it has 2 named female characters. That's about 22% of these 7,500 films. So 22% have 2 named female characters who never speak to one another throughout the course of events in the film, who definitely don't speak about a subject other than men. And then the remaining sort of 2 pieces, 10% that pass 2, meaning 10% of these 7,500 films, there are 2 named female characters and they speak to each other, but they speak to each other only about men and about no other subjects. And then this last little piece is about 10% that do not pass the Bechdel test. So in other words, that 10% has no female characters that have names, or no female characters at all, let alone ones that have names. So I think we should find these numbers, or at least I find them relatively surprising and discouraging. They're sort of echoed in a report conducted by USC last year that attempts to lay out, and I'm going to give you a couple of these, but this first table is the gender of speaking characters by different media. So this furthest to the left on the bar graph here is film. So 28%, almost 29%, are female speaking characters. That is, films that were sort of surveyed, or the number of characters that were surveyed, and you can see the number in the bottom right-hand corner, just over 11,000, included less than 30% female speaking characters. That does not mean no female characters, background actors, for instance, but speaking characters. It's higher in some of the other media forms, like broadcast, just under 40%, cable, so HBO, MTV, Showtime, just also under 40%, and streaming, so Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, anyone who just does streaming only content, just under 40%. So film is in fact the worst offender here. But that across the board, media platforms surveyed here, and again, over 11,000, less than half of the characters are female who have speaking parts across media. There's another small graph over here indicating the percentage of balanced cast that is evenly distributed between male and female speaking roles, and only 18% across all of these media forms have balanced cast, relatively even male and female speaking parts, and that the total ratio of male to female 2-to-1 in terms of speaking characters. This next report, table from the report, deals with who writes these stories. So there might be a great reason why there are so few speaking female characters, and that might be because of who is behind writing the stories that become film and television. So again, we can see here in this, for this left column, the comparison between male and female writers. So in film, just shy of 90% of the narratives written by men, whereas just over 10% written by women. So film is by far the worst offender. Again, broadcast here, just under 70% male to just over 30% female. So again, people like HBO, Showtime, or excuse me, that's broadcast, NBC, CBS. Cable is a little bit better, just over 70 to almost 30% of male writers, almost 30% female writers. And streaming is even a little better than that. So I suppose we should potentially applaud Netflix a little bit for having Netflix, cable, and broadcast for having closer to equal numbers than film. And we can see the total number of writers surveyed in the bottom right-hand corner there, almost 6,500. So almost 6,500 writers that they examined who were active in film, broadcast television, cable television, or streaming services, and the ratio across the board of male to female writers, 2.5 to 1. So we can see that in terms of who's writing these stories, it is clearly dominated. The highest percent being about 30% of female writers, clearly still largely dominated by men. So men are the ones who are writing the stories, and we can see that filter down to the kinds of characters that we're focused on, who gets to talk, who doesn't get to talk, whose stories are being told. These numbers are perhaps even more harrowing when we think about who's directing. So that is who is behind the camera, not just who writes the words, but who structures how the stories are told visually. So we can see here, film, again, is perhaps the worst of the offenders, with almost 97% of films that were surveyed, or directors who were examined, which again, we can see the total number in the bottom right-hand corner, just over 4,000. So 4,000 directors, and almost 97% of them were men, and under 4% were women. Broadcast, almost 83% men to 17% women. Cable, almost 85% men to 15% women. And streaming, almost 89% men to 11% women. So again, we see perhaps better ratios in broadcast by far than in film. And the ratio overall across all media platforms being 5.6 male directors for every one female director. So again, these numbers are quite staggering in terms of who gets to speak, who gets to tell the story or write the story, and who gets to structure the vision, the world of the film, and how the sort of bodies in question or the characters are rendered, are represented. This aligns a great deal with feminist film theory, particularly from the 1970s. There's a pioneering film theorist named Laura Mulvey who suggested a concept known as the male gaze. Now, effectively what she said is that as all of us know, we live in a patriarchal society, and that extends to cinematic practices, so to how film is made. So what she posited when she said the male gaze is that the camera, by virtue of the fact that it is an extension of the patriarchy, just reproduces that patriarchal relationship. So the camera can't help but look at things through a masculine lens. no pun intended. So through a masculine lens, that is, the camera is effectively male. It looks at everything as a male does, and that's echoed by how many men are apparently allowed to be directors of film, because they themselves are male and therefore apparently would be more expert at wielding a masculine device like the camera. And so what happens here is she says that woman becomes an image and man becomes a bearer of the look. So women in cinema, by her argument, become beautiful images. So for instance, this question of Sarah Huckabee Sanders, right? Not meeting a certain standard of female idealism, right? She doesn't look a particular way, and so she's not fulfilling her end as an image, as something people would want to look at. And we see some of that coming out in the fact that she looks like a soccer mom, she looks like this, she looks like that, right? And so for Mulvey, she is failing to be the image, and men therefore don't want to look at her, right? For Mulvey, man has to become the bearer of the look. So he's the one who does the looking, right? He looks, and in fact, he is not looked at. So the way that the bodies are treated in film for Mulvey is very different, because as she says, and you can see on this slide, man cannot gaze at his exhibitionist like. So the last thing that a masculine camera wants is to look at another male in the same way that it would look at a female. So it treats the bodies, the camera, just by virtue of being an extension of the patriarchy, treats these bodies quite differently. It treats one as something to be looked at and enjoyed, and another as something to be a speaking part, controlling the narrative, but not to be looked at in quite the same way. This is also echoed in the USC report, where they have a figure on character sexualization by gender. So with these three categories, sexy clothing, nudity, and attractiveness, with the red bar, of course, being females, right? So characters in sexy clothing, they found almost 40% of female characters that they examined were at some point in time in what they would call sexy clothing, whatever sort of subjectivity we allow for that, I suppose, what we would consider sexy clothing. They had a bar that they had sort of set for it, and they found that, just shy of 40% of female characters were seen in something that could be called sexy clothing, as opposed to not even 8% of male characters. Similar numbers with nudity, right? Over 30% of female characters appearing nude to just over 10% of male characters appearing nude. And the last bit of information is attractiveness. Again, I suppose a more subjective category, but characters who were considered attractive by these standards, about 11.5% to 3.5%, male to female. So again, a great discrepancy between the quote-unquote attractive female characters and the attractive male characters. And this is not a new phenomenon. So the top image there is a 1920s film star by the name of Theda Bara, and she has this sort of dark, vampy persona, and very, very overtly sexualized. I'll show you one image, another image in just a moment. But this aligns with what Laura Mulvey had said about women and what they represent to patriarchy. So for Mulvey, they're threatening. They're inherently threatening because they don't have power. So the assumption is that they're going to try to get power. So the worst thing for a sort of patriarchal system is an empowered woman. So the way that male characters and men in general can sort of get around this with respect to film is in two ways. One is overvaluating. What she means by that is building the woman as the image up so much and almost creating a sort of worship, a sort of cult. You think about some of these female stars who have a sort of almost cultish following for their beauty. Someone like a Marilyn Monroe, for instance, might have this. The other is through narrative means, narratives of investigation. So narratives in which of course, male character would investigate a female character, and he would decide whether to ultimately save the guilty woman or punish the guilty woman for all of her sins. And Theda Bara I think you can probably guess, was never saved. She's the punished character because she's sinful, she's dark, she's very sexualized. So this image is also Theta Bara. So you might think, as I did when I first saw this image, that that's sort of a risque and shocking image, even by today's standards. And this is a publicity image of Theta Bara from the 1920s, who again played this vampy, dark character who always lured men to their doom. And how did she lure them to their doom? Almost always through sexual means. She seduced them, and that they fell into her trap, and the end result was their downfall. And of course, their attempt or determination of whether or not she was worth saving or worth condemning, which almost always she's subject to condemnation. When you contrast that with somebody like this is Mary Pickford, a film star of the same era, so Silent Star, 1920s, and she has this sort of all-American girl look to her, and they were very insistent on her continuously playing a girl. She played characters that were always referred to as girls all the way up into her mid-30s. So at a point in time when we would probably no longer call someone a girl, but the wholesome attitude or the wholesome ideal of girlhood as opposed to the darkness of someone like Theta Bara. And here, you have her, instead of Theta Bara's straight-on gaze, looking off to the side a little, and of course with a kitten and these wonderful ringlet curls and this soft focus. So absolutely the opposite of someone like Theta Bara, this all-American innocence. And so you can sort of imagine the kinds of narratives that Mary Pickford would be involved in. None where she would be seducing men with her sexuality, none where she would be punished for her sins, but instead ones where she, would be saved by male characters because she would be worthy of saving. You can also contrast this is Rudolph Valentino, so a silent film star who was sort of thought as the sexual icon for female viewers. And I think this is noteworthy because Theta Bara being a sexual icon, she's smoldering and dark and most importantly, almost always scantily clad. Whereas Valentino here, he's got this sort of 1,000-yard stare looking off to the side, out of the frame. But he's not looking directly at us, and there's no suggestion of the kind of sexuality that someone like Theta Bara represents. So on the one hand, sexualized female character contrasted to innocent all-American girl figuration, and then here we have the masculine version of sexuality, which of course involves no nudity whatsoever, not the sense of like overt sexuality that someone like Bara supposedly has. I'm going to show you a clip next. It's a relatively lengthy one, but I want to set it up properly. It's from a film noir known as Double Indemnity. And this entire genre, film noir, came about at the time of World War II and after World War II. And essentially, it's famous for a couple of things. One of them is the style, that it has a lot of shadows, but the other is the figure of the femme fatale. And this is of particular interest to me today for reasons I think you'll sort of see. But she is a figure who almost always lures men to their doom. Otherwise, innocent men, not necessarily wholesome men, but men who didn't offend too badly. They weren't too terrible of criminals, but they get lured into more nefarious acts through a sexualized femme fatale. And film scholars frequently link this figure to the post-World War II moment when the men had sort of come home from war to find women were not in the home as much as they had been previously. Since they had left the home to be a part of the workforce and help the war effort, they came home to a confusing new social circumstance where women were not the women that they left, at least by their own kind of understanding. So the femme fatale represents this new woman, this threat, this upending of traditional gender roles. So I'll let you get a look at this. This is Walter Neff, who is an insurance salesman who comes into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Dietrichson, and this is his first meeting with Mrs. Dietrichson, who is the sort of blonde femme fatale. So a few things that I think are sort of noteworthy about that clip, and the first is her appearance at the top of the stairs, of course dressed in nothing but a towel, with the suggestion that she might not be wearing anything underneath, and his joke about insurance coverage, where he laughs to himself and says that he wouldn't want to leave her uncovered. And of course, the joke about his awareness that she is currently uncovered, and the joke about pigeons potentially looking at her while she's bathing. When he walks into the living room, this clear sense that this momentary reaction or interaction between the two of them has left him sort of rattled and sucked into her web, right? That he can't wait, or all he can think about is not having the staircase between the two of them. And she descends the stairs buttoning up, or deliberately we get the sense that she's just gotten dressed, that she's reminding us of her sort of semi-nude status moments ago. So this is the sort of classic femme fatale, that from a glance, from one exchange, she'll suck him in, and that he's going to fall for it. Throughout the course of the film, he will go on to then try to be with her and be sucked into killing her husband, and have to decide how guilty she is and whether or not she is worthy of saving. We see something similar in a contemporary example of the Avengers, and this is Scarlett Johansson playing Black Widow, which I think has some really strong connotations for what I'm talking about. And I think this is important for that reason, as well as for issues of costume, for example, but also for the fact that the Avengers, importantly, is one of the films with an ensemble cast with a sort of token female character, which I think is an important issue that I'm going to talk about momentarily with another example. But I'll let you get a look at this. And again, there's a suggestion that she has sort of lured this bad guy who's attempting to interrogate her. She's lured him there with the promise of something that could have happened tonight. The promise of the possibility of sex with her, essentially. So the fact that she comes back for her shoes is, I think, particularly noteworthy, right? So like Indiana Jones with his hat, the important thing to this character is her high heels, is her dress, right? Is her, on the one hand, incredible prowess with fighting, but on the other hand, this overt sexuality, this particular kind of image of womanhood. She doesn't wear what seems to be the most comfortable or ideal fighting gear, but that she always has to dress like the most feminine version of herself, like the most sort of sexualized version. And this is consistent across a lot of female superheroes. So these images are from a Tumblr called Heroines in Heels. So this is Mila Jovovich as Ultraviolet. You can see the caption on the bottom, written for the Tumblr, a sword-wielding vampire who can mentally morph her hair/outfit into just about any color. Too bad she didn't have the ability to morph the high heel over-the-knee boots into something more appropriate for butt kicking, right? So the impracticality of her being able to change absolutely anything about herself, but she's in a crop top and over-the-knee high-heeled boots. Similarly, and this is a joke, at a couple of times in this film Jurassic World, in which the main female character refuses to remove her nude pumps while running from a genetically engineered dinosaur. And at one point in time, her male counterpart references this, and she sort of pulls her shirt in, ties it together, and then acts as if she's actually changed something and made herself more appropriate for being out in the jungle. And here, this is Good Luck Chuck. Chuck's agent, Sarah Walker, totally practical. So the idea that an agent, a federal agent, would wear a sort of hip holster, thigh holster for her gun, strappy giant sandals, and a slinky black dress is the most practical thing for doing her job. Now, this conversation about costuming is sort of returned in Wonder Woman on the one hand. So this is from a BuzzFeed article kind of focusing on some of the controversy surrounding Justice League recently. So we have costumes in both of these images from Wonder Woman. So the caption says, this Greco-Roman inspired armored costumes were designed by Lindy Hemming, and while she's not the costume designer for Justice League, the newest film of the DC universe, you'd think the costumes would pretty much stay the same, right? So this is commenting on a film with a female director and a female costume designer that came out before Justice League, that is Wonder Woman, and the idea that the Amazons pictured here in the left and the right-hand image, right, when they're doing battle, as it says, with breastplates and clothing that fully covered their torso because they're fighting Germans who invaded their land. So the idea that the costume designer for Justice League would probably just follow suit. And these are some of the images or the poster for Wonder Woman v. Justice League. And I think it's interesting, on the one hand, costuming, which we'll talk about again in a second, but also, again, this token female character. It's very rare to have a token male character among these ensemble casts. Here we have the costumes for Justice League, a film by a male director with a male costume designer, with, I think, some really noteworthy changes to the kinds of apparel that the Amazon characters are wearing. So instead of like breastplates and coverage, we get mini skirts and like bra tops with some strange occasional shoulder pads, I suppose. BuzzFeed provided this exact side-by-side comparison for the same character in Wonder Woman versus the character in Justice League. So the idea of these costumes and them, on the one hand, being incredibly illogical, and on the other hand, a very clear distinction between what it looks like when you have a female creative team for Wonder Woman and a male creative team for Justice League, and what kind of impact that might have. By way of conclusion, I sort of wanted to just make some recommendations or point out some female directors who are currently working in the United States, who are among that 4% of women directors operating right now. And the first among them, Patty Jenkins, who of course did Wonder Woman. The other kind of major film she's known for is Monster. Ava DuVernay, who is not only a female director, but is a Black woman. So there are even fewer women of color directing in Hollywood in particular, but globally. So she's the director of Selma, the forthcoming A Wrinkle in Time, as well as the documentary 13th. Catherine Bigelow, who is probably the most decorated director on this list. She is, in fact, the first and only female director to win an Academy Award for directing. But she's a sort of an anomaly in some ways because she tells and directs very sort of masculine storyline, like The Hurt Locker, like Zero Dark 30, that are sort of action films or action dramas, instead of what many women sort of end up directing. So she did The Hurt Locker, Strange Days, Zero Dark 30, her newest one, Detroit, and going all the way back to the 90s, Point Break. Mary Harron, who did American Psycho and Notorious Betty Page. Jane Campion, who did In the Cut and The Piano. And last but not least, probably my favorite on this list is Sofia Coppola, though, of course, there is some potential nepotism, given that she is Francis Ford Coppola's daughter. But she just did The Beguiled. She's well known for The Virgin Suicides, for Marie Antoinette, and of course for The Bling Ring, the true story of all of those kids who broke into famous celebrities' houses and stole things from their homes. So please consider checking some of those out if we want to sort of support the 4% who are female directors working in the United States as a way of telling a different kind of story and creating a different kind of image of what femininity looks like. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about and some things to do, movies and directors we might want to follow. Let's see if we have any questions or comments in the chat box. We've reposted the links for the 2 satires of Sean Spicer and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, in case you didn't do that before the webinar. And we have a link also to a program by another branch called Real Women, spelled R-E-E-L, Women. And I believe it's a program that every month they show a film at the library and they invite other people to attend as well as members. Well, Kate, I'm not seeing any questions. Have you thought of a question you might ask? Well, I know one of the questions was, you know, what can we do? And I appreciate the list of movies that you shared as to perhaps some movies we can support, supporting women directors by attending those movies. Oftentimes the reason given for not choosing a woman director is that it may not be commercially successful, but I think Wonder Woman certainly proved that false, and other women directors have also. So that certainly is one direction to go.
Sure. I mean, and even in putting together that list, many of those women have been directing for a long time. But if you look, for instance, at their IMDb pages versus the IMDb pages for male directors who've been in Hollywood about as long, there's no comparison. They're clearly just not getting the opportunity. So being conscious about supporting, perhaps not just because it's by a female director, but being that much more conscious about going to see something we might be interested in when we also know we would be supporting a female director.
And I think we also know that their view and ways of presenting it, you gave a good example in the costuming itself. The Justice League is pretty much a male fantasy view of the Amazon woman, whereas the woman director, and it's more of a realistic costume, attractive, but not a really sexualized version of a costume. So I think we would appreciate those kinds of differences that are going to be visible in perhaps movies created by women directors.
Chelsea, I have a question. This is Kate. The Bechdel test is pretty simplistic. Are there some movies that are not served well by this test that you are aware of?
I mean, I think it is an incredibly simple way to go about things, right? It's not at all nuanced because it doesn't, it automatically assumes that it's limiting, for example, to have women discussing men. That is a sort of limit imposed that's problematic in some way, right? But it doesn't, for instance, take into account like the nature of some of those conversations, because if, for instance, we were talking about a political figure, for example, like it sort of assumes that, at least as I read it, it assumes that talking about men would mean talking about boyfriends or talking about male significant others, as opposed to the whole sort of plethora of ways in which men could enter conversations between two women. But I do think it is an interesting, the simplistic nature of it can be useful because it's a clear-cut, non-interpretive, non-subjective way of litmus test, way of measuring something. So I do find it useful in that regard. It also, I mean, it doesn't take into account a film that would have an ensemble cast of women, for example, because all it would do is pass the Bechdel test, but it wouldn't say go above and beyond by having no conversations that are about men. I mean, I think about something, one of the frustrations I have with a film like Bridesmaids, which I do actually think is really funny and sort of clever in that it's so focused on a marriage, but there's almost no appearance of the husband character who's about to get married to the main female character. Instead, it's about this female friendship. And it certainly has some sort of gross out humor. But one of the things I've always found frustrated when watching it is the introduction of a romantic storyline that can feel a little forced. Because apparently you can't have a story involving two women and their friendship without introducing and pursuing a new relationship, a romantic storyline between two characters. You have to apparently have that. So I think something like that, its progressive nature isn't served by the limitation of something like the Bechdel test, because it doesn't kind of address the fact that 80% of the film doesn't really have any men in it, because it would be undone by the portion that sort of has, or it would just check those boxes. It would just say it passes the Bechdel test, but it doesn't go beyond to say it goes so much further than that. It has the majority of conversations that are not about male characters, for instance, or not about men. So I think there are some sort of limitations built into that, but so much of this conversation, I mean, if you've ever spoken about this issue to people, even this question of like the Justice League, people are absolutely defending the vision of the Amazons in Justice League. And so it feels to me like what's nice or enduring about the Bechdel test is its simplicity. You can say characters either did or did not speak about something. You don't really have to disagree with one another about like the nature of costumes. So it's less disagreement, less subjectivity, less opinion, less taste, and it's just objective. So yeah, I would suppose it is both limiting and useful in its simplicity.
Well, thank you. It's worth thinking beyond the test to that deeper level and thinking about how it actually does fail movies to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
Yes. So I think we've had a good hour now. So
we probably should wrap up.
Yes.
I agree.
And at some stage in the near future, we will